The sun hung low over a dusty track in the American South, casting long shadows across a world that believed it had already determined the limits of human capability based not on evidence but on the color of a man's skin. The year was 1936, and the doctrine of racial superiority had woven itself so deeply into the fabric of competitive athletics that it was no longer questioned, debated, or examined but simply accepted as scientific fact by coaches, administrators, physicians, and the general public alike. White athletes dominated the podiums at every major competition, filled the record books with times that were considered the pinnacle of human achievement, and occupied the imagination of a sporting world that could not conceive of any serious challenge to this natural order. The newspapers of the era wrote with casual certainty about the physiological advantages inherent in European bloodlines, about the refined training techniques that could only emerge from civilized coaching methods developed in prestigious universities, and about the obvious natural order that placed certain races above others on the athletic field just as surely as it placed them above others in every other sphere of human endeavor. This was not presented as prejudice or bigotry but rather as objective science, confirmed by researchers at the most respected institutions, published in peer-reviewed journals, and accepted as fundamental truth by everyone who mattered in the world of competitive sport. Into this world of absolute certainty, this fortress of comfortable lies built upon foundations of prejudice and maintained by walls of institutional power, stepped a figure so unremarkable, so thoroughly dismissed by the establishment that controlled every aspect of athletic competition, that his very presence at the starting line seemed almost an administrative error that would surely be corrected before any damage could be done to the existing order. The man who would shatter one of the greatest lies in sporting history emerged from circumstances so modest, so far removed from the gleaming facilities and professional coaching staffs that produced champion athletes, that they barely registered in the consciousness of the athletic establishment that would eventually be forced to confront his excellence. He was born into a family of sharecroppers in the rural Deep South, his arrival into the world marked not by celebration but by the immediate calculation of another mouth to feed and another body that would eventually be required to work the fields that enriched white landowners while keeping black families in perpetual poverty. His childhood was defined by labor rather than leisure, by survival rather than sport, and by the constant awareness that his black skin made him vulnerable to violence and humiliation from any white person who chose to assert the power that society had granted them. He spent his earliest years running not for glory or recognition but for the most practical purposes imaginable, chasing down rabbits and other small game that supplemented the family's meager diet, racing barefoot along the dirt roads that connected one hardscrabble farm to another, and fleeing from threats both real and imagined that awaited black children who wandered too far from the relative safety of their own communities. His legs grew strong not through carefully designed training programs but through necessity, through the daily demands of a life that required constant motion simply to survive. The discovery of his extraordinary athletic gift came almost by accident, emerging from the informal competitions that provided one of the few sources of entertainment available to black communities systematically excluded from every other form of public recreation. On Sundays after church services, young men would gather in open fields to race against one another, with the winners earning small prizes and the admiration of their neighbors. It was at one of these humble gatherings that he first demonstrated abilities that seemed to transcend the normal limits of human speed, defeating boys several years older than himself by margins that left spectators speechless with amazement. A traveling minister who organized informal track meets for black communities throughout the region happened to witness one of these performances and recognized immediately that this young man possessed something extraordinary, a combination of explosive power and natural technique that transcended anything he had observed in decades of watching amateur athletes compete. The minister began to spread word of this prodigy through the informal networks that connected black communities across the South, the church congregations and fraternal organizations, and whispered conversations that served as the only communication channels available to a people systematically excluded from mainstream society. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, opportunities began to materialize for the young runner whose name was beginning to be spoken with wonder in communities he had never visited. The training methods he developed were necessarily unorthodox, shaped not by coaching manuals or scientific research but by intuition, experimentation, and the pure joy of movement that had characterized his running since childhood. He would practice his starts against the old mule that pulled the family plow, exploding forward at the crack of a whip and racing the animal for the first 50 yards of a furrow, developing explosive power through competition with a beast that knew nothing of athletic technique but provided a consistent benchmark against which progress could be measured. He would run along the railroad tracks that crossed the county, matching his stride to the rhythm of passing trains and learning to maintain his speed over distances that would have exhausted less determined athletes. He experimented endlessly with his starting position and his initial drive, discovering through trial and error that the upright posture recommended by the coaching manuals he occasionally glimpsed in public libraries was far less effective than a lower, more aggressive stance that allowed him to explode forward with maximum power. When he attempted to explain these discoveries to the few people who would listen, they usually dismissed his observations as the confused notions of an uneducated field hand who could not possibly understand the scientific principles that governed athletic performance. He learned to keep his methods to himself, perfecting them in solitude while outwardly conforming to whatever expectations others placed upon him. The first organized competition he entered as a young adult revealed the enormous gap between his abilities and those of every other runner in his community. He won by such absurd margins that other competitors stopped bothering to race against him, recognizing that there was no honor in finishing a distant second to someone who seemed to operate on an entirely different level of human capability. Word of his dominance spread through the networks of black athletic competition that existed parallel to but completely separate from the white sporting establishment, and invitations began to arrive from communities across the South seeking to test their local champions against this phenomenon from the cotton fields. He traveled by bus and by train and sometimes by foot to these competitions, never earning more than small prizes that barely covered his expenses but building a reputation that grew with each victory. The times he recorded at these events, though measured with amateur equipment and disputed by those who refused to believe them, suggested that he was running at a level that would be competitive with the finest white sprinters in the nation. Yet the barriers separating black athletes from white competition seemed as insurmountable as the walls of any prison, enforced not by laws but by the absolute certainty of the white sporting establishment that no good could come from integration. The technique that would eventually revolutionize sprinting and expose the fraudulent science of the era emerged not from any coaching manual or research laboratory but from the intuitive genius of a man who had learned to run before he had learned to read the books that would have told him his methods were impossible. The conventional wisdom of the era, developed by white coaches and endorsed by white scientists, held that the proper sprinting form required an upright posture from start to finish, with the head held high and the body perpendicular to the ground at all times. This technique was taught in every university athletic program, prescribed in every coaching manual, and enforced by coaches who believed they were transmitting scientific truth to their athletes. What the young man from the cotton fields had discovered through his own experimentation was that this conventional wisdom was fundamentally wrong, that the upright posture actually slowed a runner down by forcing him to fight against the forward momentum that was the essence of sprinting speed. His own approach was radically different, involving a deep forward lean at the start that gradually straightened as the race progressed, allowing him to channel all his explosive power directly into forward motion rather than wasting energy on maintaining an artificial posture. When officials and coaches first witnessed this technique, they instinctively rejected it as incorrect, as the flawed method of an untrained athlete who did not know any better. They could not conceive that their own methods might be inferior to those developed by a black man with no formal education. The opportunity to test his abilities against white competition came through a series of unlikely events that revealed cracks in the seemingly impermeable wall separating the races in athletic competition. A regional qualifying meet for the national championships was to be held in a border state where the rules governing racial separation were slightly less rigid than in the Deep South, and through a combination of bureaucratic oversight, sympathetic officials who believed in fair competition, and the persistent advocacy of the minister who had first discovered his talent, his entry was accepted. The news that a black sprinter would be competing against white athletes generated enormous controversy, with some calling for the meet to be cancelled rather than polluted by racial integration and others defending the decision on grounds that athletic merit should be the only criterion for participation. The athletic establishment that governed the sport issued carefully worded statements expressing concerns about the precedent being set while stopping short of explicitly prohibiting his participation. By the time the day of competition arrived, the controversy had attracted attention far beyond the normal audience for a regional qualifying meet, drawing spectators and journalists who sensed that something historically significant might be about to occur. The white coaches and athletes who gathered for the event regarded his presence with a mixture of amusement and annoyance that revealed their absolute confidence in their own superiority. They had heard rumors of fast black sprinters emerging from the segregated South, but such rumors were common and usually amounted to nothing when tested against the properly trained products of prestigious university athletic programs. The scientific literature was quite clear on this point, having established through decades of research that Negro athletes, while sometimes capable of surprising performances in informal settings, lacked the refined nervous systems and mental discipline necessary to compete under pressure against genetically superior white competitors. This was not racism, the scientists assured their readers, but simply the objective findings of rigorous research conducted according to the highest standards of the scientific method. The white athletes lined up against him expected an easy victory that would confirm everything they had been taught about the natural hierarchy of races, a public demonstration that would put to rest any foolish notions about black athletic equality and restore the comfortable certainty that the world was exactly as they believed it to be. The qualifying heats revealed immediately that something unprecedented was occurring, something that threatened to overturn decades of carefully constructed racial theory in the space of a few seconds. He exploded from the blocks with a violence that startled the timekeepers, his body pitched forward at an angle that several officials initially believed must constitute a false start, his arms driving and his legs churning in a display of raw power that seemed almost primitive in its intensity. Yet the rules were clear, and he had not false started, and the watches did not lie. His time in the first heat was faster than any time recorded in the region that year, faster than the personal bests of most of the white athletes who had expected to dominate the competition, and so shocking that many officials simply refused to believe it. They examined the timing equipment for malfunctions, measured the track to ensure it had been laid out correctly, and consulted the wind gauges to confirm that no artificial assistance had inflated his performance. Finding nothing amiss, they were forced to record the time and allow him to advance to the next round, though whispered conversations in the officials' tent suggested that something would have to be done to prevent this embarrassing situation from continuing. The semi-finals produced even more disturbing results for those invested in maintaining the racial hierarchy of athletic competition. Running against the strongest white sprinters in the region, athletes who had been groomed for success by the finest coaches and trained in the most modern facilities, he won his heat by a margin that made the race appear almost comical in its one-sidedness. The white athletes who had expected to compete for victory found themselves racing instead for second place, their best efforts wholly inadequate to keep pace with a man whose technique they had been taught was impossible and whose race they had been assured was genetically inferior. The coaches who had trained these athletes watched with expressions that combined disbelief with something approaching fear, recognizing that if the results of this competition were allowed to stand, everything they had built their careers upon would come crashing down. They demanded explanations from the officials, suggested that the competitor must be cheating in some way that had not yet been detected, and insisted that additional scrutiny be applied to his equipment and his technique before he was allowed to compete in the final. The officials, many of whom shared the coach's beliefs about racial hierarchy, were sympathetic but found themselves constrained by rules that had been written without anticipating the need to exclude unexpectedly fast black athletes. The final race assembled 8 athletes on the starting line under a sky that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was to come. 7 of the competitors were white, representing prestigious universities and elite athletic clubs, their uniforms gleaming with the emblems of institutions that had never admitted black students and never would. The 8th was a black man from the cotton fields of the Deep South, wearing a borrowed uniform that did not quite fit, his body carrying the visible marks of a life of manual labor rather than the sculpted physique of a professionally trained athlete. The crowd that had gathered to witness this historic confrontation buzzed with an energy that combined excitement with profound anxiety, for word had spread about the remarkable performances in the earlier rounds, and many spectators had come specifically to witness what they expected would be the natural correction of an aberration, the moment when true athletic excellence would assert itself over the temporary delusion of an untrained outsider. The white competitors positioned themselves in their blocks with the studied confidence of men who had been told their entire lives that they were destined for victory, their coaches watching from the sidelines with stopwatches ready to record what they fully expected would be vindication of everything they believed. The starter raised his pistol, and in the moment of silence that followed, the weight of history seemed to press down upon the track like a physical force. The gun fired, and what happened in the next 10 seconds would reverberate through athletic history for generations to come, though the establishment would spend years trying to deny and minimize and explain away what everyone present witnessed with their own eyes. He launched himself from the blocks with his characteristic explosive drive, his body angled forward in a technique they had insisted was biomechanically impossible, and within the first 10 meters, he had established a lead that only grew more pronounced as the race progressed. The white competitors, trained in the proper upright form that every coaching manual prescribed, found themselves hopelessly outclassed by a man who ran as if he had discovered secrets about human movement that their sophisticated scientific methods had somehow missed. By the halfway point, the race was essentially over, the gap between him and the second-place finisher so vast that spectators began to murmur in disbelief at what they were witnessing. He crossed the finish line alone, so far ahead of his nearest competitor that the margin itself seemed like an deliberate insult to everything the athletic establishment held sacred about racial hierarchy and the natural order of competition. The timekeepers stared at their watches in silence, then conferred quietly before announcing a time that shattered the existing regional record by more than the margin of error their equipment was designed to measure. The crowd fell silent, not in celebration or admiration but in a kind of collective shock that bordered on denial of the evidence their own eyes had provided. The immediate reaction of the athletic establishment revealed far more about the true nature of the lie he had exposed than the race itself could ever demonstrate. Rather than celebrating a remarkable athletic achievement that should have been front-page news across the nation, the officials and coaches who controlled the sport immediately began constructing alternative explanations that would allow them to maintain their comfortable beliefs about racial superiority. They suggested that the timing equipment had somehow malfunctioned, though examination revealed no technical problems whatsoever. They proposed that the track had been incorrectly measured, though survey teams confirmed its dimensions were accurate to the inch. They theorized that unusual wind conditions had artificially enhanced his performance, though the official wind gauge had recorded readings well within legal limits. When these explanations proved insufficient to explain away what had happened, they turned to darker accusations, suggesting that he must have cheated in some unspecified way, that his unorthodox technique constituted an unfair advantage that should be prohibited in future competitions, that the very magnitude of his victory was evidence of rule-breaking rather than athletic genius. The logic was circular and self-serving, but it was the only way they could maintain the worldview that gave meaning to their professional lives. The most revealing response came from the athlete who had been favored to win the final, a young white sprinter from a wealthy family whose connections and pedigree had marked him for athletic greatness since childhood. He had grown up in an environment of absolute privilege, trained by the finest coaches money could buy, educated at the most prestigious institutions, and told at every turn that his success was not merely possible but inevitable, the natural result of his superior breeding and refined training. The shock of his defeat went beyond mere athletic disappointment to strike at the very foundation of his identity and his understanding of the world. In the immediate aftermath of the race, still struggling to process what had happened, he approached the officials with a formal protest that would become a template for how the establishment would respond to black athletic excellence for years to come. He argued that his opponent's technique was illegal, that the forward lean violated the spirit if not the letter of the rules governing sprinting form, that the entire race should be invalidated and the results expunged from the official record. His coaches supported this demand with passionate intensity, recognizing that their own professional reputations depended on finding some explanation other than inferior training for their athletes' humiliating defeat. The debate that ensued consumed the attention of the athletic community for weeks, with traditionalists arguing passionately that unconventional techniques threatened the integrity of the sport and must be prohibited, while a smaller group of progressives cautiously suggested that perhaps athletic results should be allowed to speak for themselves. The decision reached by the governing body represented a masterclass in institutional racism disguised as procedural fairness. They ruled that his performance was legitimate and would be allowed to stand in the official record, but they also determined that his entry in the qualifying meet had been improperly processed and that he was therefore ineligible to advance to the national championships. The technicality they cited was so minor, so obviously pretextual, that even observers who shared the establishment's racial prejudices recognized it for what it was. But the ruling stood nonetheless, and the message it sent was unmistakable. Black athletes might occasionally be permitted to compete against whites, might even be allowed to win in isolated circumstances, but they would never be permitted to advance to the highest levels of the sport, never be allowed to represent the nation in international competition, never be granted the recognition and rewards that their achievements deserved. The walls separating the races in athletics remained intact, its foundation perhaps slightly shaken but its structure still secure against any challenge from below. The years that followed the historic race brought consequences that revealed the true depth and persistence of institutional racism within the athletic establishment. Despite holding a time that no other sprinter in the region could approach, he found himself systematically excluded from any competition that might bring him national recognition or financial reward. Invitations to prestigious meets that should have been automatic were mysteriously lost or indefinitely delayed. Equipment manufacturers who normally rushed to associate their products with record-holding athletes showed no interest in sponsoring a black man whose very success threatened the racial theories that most of their customers believed. The newspapers that had covered his remarkable victory with front-page attention gradually reduced their coverage to brief mentions, then to nothing at all, as if collective silence could erase the inconvenient truth he had demonstrated. When he attempted to register for other qualifying meets in subsequent years, he encountered bureaucratic obstacles that made participation effectively impossible without ever explicitly stating that his race was the reason for his exclusion. The establishment had decided that rather than confront the implications of his victory, they would simply pretend it had never happened, erasing him from the historical record through the simple expedient of denying him any further opportunities to confirm his excellence. The technique that had carried him to victory did not disappear simply because the man who pioneered it was forced into obscurity. Other black athletes who had witnessed his revolutionary approach or heard detailed descriptions of it through the informal networks of the segregated athletic community began to incorporate elements of his method into their own running, and they too began to produce times that confounded the racial theories of the establishment. White coaches who possessed both intellectual honesty and genuine curiosity about athletic performance quietly studied his technique through whatever means they could, analyzing the newspaper photographs of his historic race and interviewing witnesses who could describe his form in detail. They recognized that his approach was not merely different but genuinely superior, and they began to introduce elements of it into their own training programs, though they were always careful never to acknowledge the true source of these innovations. Within a decade, the forward lean and explosive drive that had been derided as impossible when demonstrated by a black man had become standard practice in sprint coaching, taught to white athletes as the product of advanced scientific research rather than the intuitive genius of an untrained sharecropper's son. The lie of racial athletic inferiority persisted in many quarters, but it had been fatally wounded by evidence that could be suppressed but never truly erased. The personal cost of his triumph over institutional lies proved devastatingly, tragically high. Unable to secure the sponsorships, the coaching positions, or the competitive opportunities that should have followed naturally from his demonstrated excellence, he returned to the rural South where his journey had begun, taking whatever work he could find as a manual laborer while running only in the informal community meets that had first revealed his extraordinary gift. The athletic career that should have brought him international recognition, financial security, and a permanent place in sporting history ended almost before it had properly begun, sacrificed to the determination of powerful men to preserve a comfortable lie rather than confront an uncomfortable truth. He married a woman from his community who believed in him when the world had forgotten his name, raised children who knew their father had once run faster than any man in the region regardless of what the official record said, worked the land that had shaped his body and his spirit, and grew old in the same poverty from which he had briefly emerged. He watched from an unbridgeable distance as white athletes who had adopted his technique went on to Olympic glory, their achievements celebrated in newspapers and newsreels while his own contributions remained unmentioned in the coaching manuals and history books that should have honored his pioneering work. The rehabilitation of his legacy began decades after his death, when a new generation of sports historians who had not been raised on the racial theories of the early 20th century undertook the painstaking work of recovering the lost and deliberately suppressed stories of black athletic excellence. They discovered in dusty archives and forgotten file cabinets the newspaper accounts of his record-breaking performance, preserved by chance against the determined efforts of those who would have preferred their destruction. They found the official protests filed against his technique by coaches who could not accept that their methods might be inferior to those developed by a black man, and the bureaucratic correspondence that documented his systematic exclusion from competitive athletics despite achievements that should have guaranteed his advancement. They interviewed elderly men and women who still remembered the shock of that race, who could still describe in vivid detail the impossible gap between him and his competitors and the immediate, frantic efforts of the establishment to discredit what everyone present had clearly witnessed. They traced the gradual, unacknowledged adoption of his technique through the evolution of coaching literature, demonstrating conclusively that the method now universally employed by world-class sprinters had originated not in some European research laboratory or American university athletic department but in the intuitive experimentation of a poor black man from the cotton fields of the American South. His official recognition, though it came far too late to benefit him personally, carried profound implications for the understanding of athletic history and the mechanisms of racial injustice. The governing body that had once found pretextual reasons to exclude him from competition issued a formal acknowledgement of his pioneering contributions to sprint technique, admitting implicitly that their predecessors had deliberately suppressed evidence that contradicted their racial theories. The regional record that had been allowed to stand while denying him the advancement it should have guaranteed was formally recognized as the breakthrough achievement it had always been. A scholarship fund was established in his name to support young black athletes from disadvantaged backgrounds who might otherwise be denied the opportunities their talents deserved. A documentary film brought his story to international attention, prompting widespread discussion about the countless other black athletes whose contributions had been erased by the same institutional racism that had stolen his career. These gestures could not return to him the decades of recognition and opportunity that had been taken away, but they ensured that future generations would know his name and understand his significance. The legacy of the man who exposed the biggest lie in sports extends far beyond his individual achievements on that distant afternoon when he outran not merely his competitors but an entire system designed to deny his humanity. His story demonstrates with painful clarity that the racial hierarchies constructed by the athletic establishment of his era were built not upon scientific evidence but upon prejudice dressed in the borrowed clothes of objectivity. His technique, derided as biomechanically impossible when performed by a black man, became the foundation of modern sprinting once it had been appropriated by white coaches who never acknowledged where they had learned it. His treatment at the hands of the establishment reveals the lengths to which institutions will go to protect comfortable falsehoods from inconvenient truths, the creative energy that will be devoted to explanation and denial when the alternative is admitting that fundamental beliefs were wrong. His eventual rehabilitation offers hope that justice, though it may be delayed by decades or even generations, might ultimately prevail against even the most systematic and determined efforts at erasure. In the long and continuing arc of athletic history, he stands as both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder that human excellence cannot be permanently suppressed by institutional prejudice and that truth, even when buried under decades of lies, has a way of eventually rising to the surface. The tracks where he once ran alone now host competitions where athletes of all backgrounds compete as equals, a reality he helped to create through the simple, revolutionary act of running faster than anyone had believed possible.